Good day, everyone. I'm Patrick Cronin, Asia Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute, and I'm delighted to be joined today via video with David Maxwell and Jenny Town here in Washington, D.C., and Dr. Lee Seung-hyun in Seoul. For the next hour, we want to discuss, in light of recent events, our understanding of what we call inscrutable North Korea. Just when you thought you might know it all and that there was little new to unearth about the secretive Kim family dictatorship that has run North Korea from its inception since World War II, something happens to humble us and remind us we still don't know a lot about South Korea's poor but nuclear-armed neighbor. Where in the world is Kim Jong Un has been a constant headline and refrain in recent days. Responding to the endless speculation about Kim's location and condition, the ROK Unification Minister declared that speculation had reached infodemic levels. It's interesting because health has been turned into a national security issue of the year in 2020. First COVID-19, and then the whereabouts and condition of Kim Jong Un. Since dropping out of public view after April 11, inconspicuously missing from the April 15 celebration memorializing his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, the speculation has been rife. Has he been hunkering down in Wonsan to avoid the coronavirus? Has he been recovering from surgery or from wounds suffered during a missile test mishap? Has he been in a coma, or is he dead as a result of botched surgery, heart failure, injury, or disease? It was Machiavelli who said that fortune is the ruler of half of our actions. And regardless of whether Kim Jong Un reappears in good health, we are reminded that security on the Korean Peninsula, security in Northeast Asia and beyond, can be significantly affected by the life of a leader. On Monday evening in Washington, D.C., President Donald Trump added to the intrigue by announcing he hopes Kim is well, and he knows, relatively speaking, his condition, adding that the world would soon discover the truth about Chairman Kim. So with that preamble, let's discuss lessons to be drawn from a temporary mystery about a leader of North Korea. Questions about contingency and succession that might occur, if not now, at some point in the future, and the impact of the policy of major actors, especially the United States, South Korea, and China. David Maxwell is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, but he spent a career in the United States Army, retiring after 30 years as a Special Forces colonel, having specialized a great deal on preparing for North Korean contingencies. Dr. Lee Seung-hyun is director of the Center for Chinese Studies at the influential South Korean think tank, the Yo Institute. Dr. Lee, among many other achievements, earned his PhD in Beijing and lived in China for 11 years. He brings deep understanding to North Korea and China. And Jenny Town is a fellow at the Stimson Center and the deputy director of Stimson's distinguished 38th North publication, a website devoted to providing policy and technical analysis on North Korea. Indeed, some of that analysis was all over the news recently because it was the imagery that showed that Kim Jong Un's train had stopped and been stuck in Wonsan, where the Kim family has a major retreat. So let's have a first round of questions, and the same question really for all three panelists here, about the implications of uncertainty about the condition of the supreme leader of a potential adversary armed with nuclear weapons, and what further can be done to ensure readiness, early warning, better information and intelligence, and avoiding acting either too slowly or too precipitously should there be sudden change. This is, in other words, a question about the lessons of this mystery of Kim Jong Un's whereabouts, and not to mention the mystery about whether COVID-19 has struck North Korea deeper than reported, since they've almost reported no cases in North Korea. And the analytical problem of understanding North Korea here in 2020, when we thought we knew a good deal more. Let me begin with David Maxwell, and then we'll turn to Jenny Town, and then last but not least, Dr. Lee. So David, over to you.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you for having us. I think it's a very important topic and of course, timely. I'm reminded of the old saying that war is God's way of teaching Americans geography. And I think that the most important thing to take away from all of this is exactly what you said in your preamble, is that what happens to the leader can have effects on the peninsula, regional effects, and really global effects. And so the fact that we are are looking at this so deeply, and that really the American public, South Korean public, and really the global public is concerned and worrying about this is actually a positive thing. And because I think what we're really learning is, and what most of us know, is North Korea is a hard target. And again, you described that in your preamble. It's a closed society and information is tightly controlled. The health of Kim Jong Un is a national secret. And I think, we are only going to know about his health when the regime decides to release information. But that being said, we are looking at many different scenarios. And I think that the open source reporting on this is really all over the map. And it's an indication that we just don't know what is happening. But again, I want to take away the fact that we need to really look at this as a wake-up call. We really need to examine some key questions. The first key question is, if we learn that Kim Jong Un is dead today, what actions are we going to take? What actions will the United States, South Korea, and most importantly, from a ROK-US alliance perspective, what are we going to do? And I think that this question is really one that needs to be deeply thought about. I expect that the real answer will be, well, we'll wait and see how it develops. But if that happens, we see the initiative. We see the initiative to China, perhaps. We see the initiative to internal infighting inside North Korea. We need to be ready to react, and most importantly, react from an alliance perspective. And of course, there's tremendous friction within the alliance right now that is going to prevent us from orchestrating and synchronizing a solid combined response. And so we need to look at this as a wake-up call. Now, if there's a smooth transition of power, there are opportunities that we should take advantage of. And of course, in the worst case, if there's not a smooth transition of power, there's a whole range of contingencies that we need to be prepared for. Massive humanitarian disaster inside North Korea, refugees, and of course, the worst cases, have to do with the military, the North Korean military and its weapons of mass destruction. North Korea is a complex problem, for a security problem for South Korea, for the United States, and for the region. And so we need to really think through what might happen in all of these scenarios. And so this is an opportunity. And my recommendation to U.S. and South Korean policymakers would be to establish a combined interagency task group to really look at these problems and do some tabletop exercises to really determine a combined way ahead. And again, I think this is an opportunity, as dire as the situation might be, due to the myriad outcomes that we could see if Kim Jong Un is incapacitated, if he is dead, and if there is instability and ultimately regime collapse resulting from that.
David, when we come back to a second round of questions and talk a bit about succession and contingency, it'll be interesting to hear your advice on how to avoid inadvertent escalation. Because when you talk about a smooth transition, how do we know if it's smooth or not in North Korea is an open question. But let's turn now for opening comments from Jenny Town.
Thank you, Patrick. And I would agree with David on a lot of those points. This is a wake-up call. Kim Jong-un's health, even if he is okay, alive and well, as the South Korean government is suggesting right now, he does run a number of health risks given his body mass size, given his lifestyle. And so this is something that may happen again, even if it didn't happen this time. So it's something we do need to be prepared for and think through. And, the stakes are enormously high. You have a population of 25 million people. You do have an extensive weapons of mass destruction arsenal and infrastructure, some parts of which are decentralized. You have a 1 million-man army that can be mobilized, even though right now there's major parts of the army that are mobilized for economic purposes, but they certainly can be mobilized for military purposes as well. And you have a pervasive social control infrastructure and mechanism. And the regime has complete control over the mass media in the country as well, so they can control the narrative. They also can control what information gets out to the people, but it also means that the people are unlikely to know what's happening in real time in the country if something does happen and there is rising instability. But more importantly, we won't necessarily know in real time either. And that's a huge problem when you're dealing with such a complex issue and the stakes are so high. It also comes at a time, as David alluded to, when we do have friction within the alliance, the U.S.-Korea alliance. We have growing frictions within the U.S.-Japan alliance, as well as those SMA, those burden-sharing agreements start to come up for renegotiation. And at a time when you have rising competition between US and China rather than rising cooperation. So all of these relationships have been exacerbated over the past few years. So you don't have the kind of unity you had back in 2017 when North Korea was being extremely provocative, and it really kind of brought public sentiment together. So certainly a lot of the contingency planning and tabletop exercises that David had talked about, a lot of it has been done in the past, but the political conditions are so different now that, it is something that does need to be revisited. And at the very least right now, there should be a high priority on all of the countries involved that are invested in this issue to at least be setting up mechanisms for communication, consultation, information sharing, and start that dialogue on how do we coordinate. And I think a big part of that is also resolving the burden sharing agreement with South Korea, the US and South Korea, as this stands in the way of actually being able to cooperate in a coherent manner if something does happen.
Excellent, Jenny. I want to come back to you in a second round and ask a little bit about just the question of certainty on understanding North Korea's intentions or actions. 38 North has made a great contribution to open source intelligence, because we rely on 38 North to know whether missiles are on platforms, whether they're going to be tests, what's exactly happening. And yet here we're dealing with a situation where, well, we can see a train parked, but we don't really still understand what's happening. And I want to come back to that. And as we turn now to Dr. Lee, I mean, are we in the West in particular just hyperventilating about the temporary absence of Kim Jong Un? Is China, they're taking it in stride. They don't seem to be, of course, they control the state media, but at the same time, there doesn't seem, even in South Korea, to be quite the hysteria that we've seen in most of the second half of April about wondering about Kim Jong Un's whereabouts. But how do you see this situation from where you're sitting and your understanding of China as well, Dr. Lee?
Well, thank you, Patrick, for hosting this very important and timely discussion. And also thank you for having me. I think that Kim's disappearance often creates intense fascination from the outside world because of its implication for instability in regional geopolitics. And China seems to be leaning toward the view that there is nothing unusual about Kim's health, or not something serious. But then China keeps mum on other details about the reported news reports about China's sending Mr. Song Tao, the head of the international department, the department in charge of China's affairs with North Korea. China keeps mum about what China did to help North Korea with COVID-19. From where I stand here in Seoul, Seoul also seems to, we just had at the presidential office, Blue House, the National Security Council meeting, they just held last Thursday, and they concluded that there's nothing unusual about North Korea. So both China and South Korea are leaning toward the view that all the commotion that has created, that was created by absence of Kim Jong Un is not something that shouldn't be taken to something out of line. That may be something a bit different from depending on where you stand. But I think if you look at more analytic perspective, I think there is something that we learned from this experience, which has not ended yet. And that is that we learned that we know very little about North Korea, even though we live in the 21st century. And I think like you and me and David and Jenny, I think when we analyze and conducting research on North Korea, North Korea is a country that you cannot simply go and visit and conduct a survey, ask questions to North Korean officials. What do you think about this? What do you think about this? You do you plan to fire another missiles? What do you think about Trump administration policy? Simply cannot do such kind of a normative, standard social science research when it comes to North Korea. So that's why I think there are a lot of rumors and speculations when it comes to North Korea, including the health of Kim Jong Un. So that usually analysts like me, we rely on state media, Rodong Shinmun, KCNA, but we also rely on defectors. There are a lot of defectors and institutions like where I work for here. We have accumulated records of interviews with thousands of, tens and thousands of defectors over the years. We have a record of accumulated interviews with defectors. Sometimes we get to have a glimpse of more personal glimpse of North Korea through the media outlets when there are international diplomacy happens, such as Singapore summit, multilateral negotiations, track 1.5 meetings, but then still, we have a very limited exposure and very limited sources to confidently say on an occasion like this that whether what's happening with Kim Jong Un, whether and I think that North Korea is normally in a case like this, we use the term called the black box. This is a black box model that people used to apply to Soviet policy, and when they turned their head to North Korea is another black box. So they use the analytic tools frames of a Soviet policy to North Korea. And in social science, a black box is a device, a political system, which can be viewed in terms of its inputs and outputs, but without any knowledge of its internal workings. So we know very little about internal workings of North Korea. That's why we call it a black box. But then when it comes to Soviet Union, US still used to have its embassy in Moscow, but then you don't have an embassy in Pyongyang these days. So you have very, even further limited access to the ground knowledge in what's happening in North Korea. That's why Tae Yong-ho, the North Korea diplomat who used to work in UK, who defected to South Korea 4 years ago, and he just got elected as a lawmaker. He defined North Korea as a unique state. That is that there is no country like this on this planet. North Korea is simply a very unique state. So I think when it comes to analyzing sometimes we tend to, frankly speaking, despair, even very seasoned analysts. But then particularly for this occasion about the whereabouts of Kim Jong Un, I think the focus should not be whether Kim is sick or not. I mean, we all get sick. We all get medical treatment. Sometimes we get hospitalized. So I think that the point should have been whether Kim is still in charge and whether Kim still called the shots, whether there is any signs of instability or not. That should have been at the focus of analysis rather than Kim, the person, even though Kim himself is important. And I'm also leaning to the, I talk with a lot of people here in Seoul and also in China. And I'm also leaning to that at the end of the day, Kim might show up just like nothing happened. Probably he's staying in Wonsan Resort based on Jenny's picture that you mentioned. And maybe Kim Jong Un is looking over the beach from his room. Maybe he's enjoying all this media attention that he has been generating so far. That makes him famous. However, that makes him also more dangerous too, because his disappearance makes the world realize how a dictatorship without transparency could be a liability to the world. So I think that the lesson, the real lesson that I completely agree with David and Jenny, that lesson is that we need to be prepared for contingency in North Korea. We need a plan, and I think that's the lesson that what we learned this time.
Well, excellent from all of you. And Dr. Lee, you've just raised some interesting new questions in my mind about whether there would be a passing of authority. Should Kim Jong Un go under surgery? Would it legally pass, or would it be unwritten and just unspoken? I'm even interested in if something were to happen to Xi Jinping and he had a surgery, is there a specific legal protocol in China for how authority and decisions are passed? I assume there probably is in China. North Korea, I wonder. But let's move on to a second round and kind of dig a little deeper into the impact of potential succession, no matter when it happens, if it happens, and the impact of potential contingencies. And I want to go back to Jenny first about, again, the analytical question about how would we know what's happening, given our limits of information, especially using imagery, for instance, and for the general question about North Korea's nuclear weapons and missile programs. I mean, Jenny, you might want to just give us your baseline read on where you think they've been going over the last couple of years of diplomacy, that diplomacy having been stalemated, but what you think would happen to those critical capabilities in North Korea, the nuclear weapons and missiles, if there were a crisis, if there were indeed succession underway, and what would we be seeing and when would we see it? At least some general comments on those issues.
All of the easy questions, right? Over the past couple of years, while North Korea has been engaged in diplomacy, I think there's been this expectation that they had decided to give everything up. They should stop all production, stop all development, because we're negotiating. And that's simply not how negotiations are done. I think the expectation was misplaced, and certainly through satellite imagery, we have been able to see signs that the major facilities are still active. For instance, at the Yongbyon Nuclear Scientific Research Center, they're still continuing to work on the experimental light water reactor. We haven't seen signs that the 5 megawatt reactor is operating. However, we do still see activity around the uranium enrichment facility, meaning they're probably still producing fissile material nuclear fuel in some manner, to some degree. We don't know what, because there's obvious limitations to basing analysis on satellite imagery itself. But we know there's still movement there, there's still activity there. We know the nuclear test site is still closed, it's still dysfunctional. We have not seen signs of them trying to reactivate it. We know that at Sohae, for instance, at the Sohae satellite launching station, despite the commitment to permanently dismantle the engine test stand and the launch pad there, after the Hanoi summit, they started to rebuild it. They refurbished it, they're operational. They have done engine testing, I think it was in December of last year, of new liquid fuel engines that would be suitable for ICBMs or rockets. So they do continue to develop these capabilities. They continue to test different, as we've seen lately, conventional weapon systems. They're diversifying with especially a focus on the ballistic missile side of solid fuel technologies and mobile technologies. I think what you're seeing now, especially in recent times of the short-range ballistic missile tests, is you see them kind of demonstrating capabilities that respond to changes in South Korea's capabilities as well. And so new systems that sort of fall between the thresholds of South Korea's missile defenses, and showing this, the political signal there to South Korea that the comprehensive military agreement they consider to be dead at this point. And if South Korea is going to continue to build up, then North Korea will as well. So I think, there was a moment of opportunity there where they were reassessing their choices. If they could benefit from going down a different path, they were willing to try to see how far it went. When they didn't see quick results, and I think their expectations were probably overestimated as well as to how quickly things could move, they decided to continue down the path that they were before, and put diplomacy aside for the moment. I'm sure they're watching the election cycle closely. I'm sure they're watching what's happening in Washington, D.C., even with COVID response, very closely, to see if there are opportunities in the future to explore that again, and would they have any expectation to get something different. But given all of this, it's very hard to determine the degree to which they're developing new systems. We know they're working on a new submarine, for instance. We've seen glimpses of a submarine that they're working on, but we can't tell much from those glimpses. We need to see the whole thing. They have tested a new SL, submarine launched ballistic missile. And presumably they've done some ejection testing at that site as well, trying to build up their capabilities. But there's only so much we can tell from satellite imagery, and this is the big problem if something does happen in North Korea and there is instability in North Korea, is that we're only going to be able to get bits and pieces of information at a time. It'll be very hard to see these signs of instability in the country and to know how severe they are or how widespread they are. We can do the all source analysis and try and figure out from the propaganda if those messages start to change. We get pinpoints of information from places like Daily NK and other places that have informants in the country, but how representative those experiences are is anyone's guess. And so it's really a matter of information sharing and coordination among all the parties that have different pinpoints of information. And it's going to be a very complex situation.
Thank you. I want to turn back to Dr. Lee and ask about not only China's view of this nuclear missile diplomacy and basically the continuing buildup that Jenny's just described, I think very well, but also if there were a contingency to happen, whether China is fully prepared to intervene if Kim were dead or incapacitated, or saw the United States maybe moving with South Korea to influence the succession. So I'm just trying to get a sense of, from Dr. Lee, China's role that they're playing to influence North Korean policy in the diplomacy, but also in a contingency. So Dr. Lee, back to you.
Well, this is a very good question, and also a question that over the years I also ask a lot to my Chinese colleagues, and for them this is also a very sensitive topic. So there is a limitation about how much they could share with the foreign scholars, foreign analysts like me. But then when it comes to North Korean contingency, I think there is at least a minimum of protocols. That is that China has a plan. And then what the plan is about is murky. And the question, there's a question about whether China will intervene unilaterally before U.S. send troops, just in case. I'm talking about hypothetical situation. Just before the U.S. troops or South Korean troops enter North Korea to secure nuclear stockpiles, nuclear weapons. There are a lot of speculation about that. And people also talk about how China intervened in North Korea during the Korean War, how China recently has been expanding its territory in South China Sea, and entering the Xi Jinping era. China's foreign diplomacy behavior is much more assertive. So speculating and also extrapolating from all these pieces of reasonings and thinkings, some people claim that China, when there is a contingency and amid the deepening rivalry and conflict between U.S. and China, not to mention the trade war, but also the bigger rivalry for leadership. Some people speculate that China will unilaterally send troops when there is a contingency in North Korea. This sounds feasible to the uninformed ears, but my sense, based on, I may be wrong, but my sense of having a repeated conversation about this is that China will be international body such as UN and China will use that international medium to legitimize China's behavior of intervening in a contingent situation in North Korea. And China will initiate and suggest sending a peacekeeping troops to North Korea. And China will be suggest, but China will be a little bit reactive rather than proactive, because China knows fully well that it is a country that has the most influence on North Korea. And whenever when something happens in North Korea, whole world's attention just fixated on China. And China gets a lot of misunderstanding and the blames by the international community about what's happening in North Korea and the sanctions about North Korea. And even during the in the lead days to the Singapore summit in 2018, President Trump publicly complained that China might be behind interrupting and persuading Kim Jong Un, when Kim Jong Un was a little bit changed his behavior and a little bit hesitant to initiate the context that led to the Singapore summit. So Trump complained at least 3 times publicly that Xi Jinping might be behind, pulling strings behind Kim Jong Un. So interestingly, this is a very interesting fact that China is very consciously aware about the international reputation, particularly when it comes to North Korea, because it is the country that it has the most leverage and influence, and it could be easily pointed out when things go wrong. So that China wants to legitimize its actions when it comes to the contingency. And I'm leaning toward the view that China will be less inclined to first order of behavior is to cooperate with the United States. Rather, China will reach out to international bodies such as United States, United Nations, to peacekeeping operations, to send troops, medical troops, rebuilding operations work. That's how China engages in North Korea when there is a contingency. That's my sense so far. But maybe they have different plans when the news reports for the last 2 weeks happening and China changed their mind. But at least up to that level, that was my understanding about what might China do.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Finally, let's turn back to David Maxwell and talk a little bit about the U.S. and the ROK-U.S. alliance readiness to deal with contingencies, to understand how not to escalate or how to be ready to move in. And it's one thing, as David's been involved in some of the exquisite secret defense plans between the United States and South Korea over the decades. It's great to have an exquisite plan. The question is, are we ready, and are we politically willing to enact one of those plans? And separate from that, if we're only dealing with a very limited, murky scenario, where you see the Chinese, maybe as Dr. Lee's describing, have the agility to move health troops in or to respond to a limited situation quickly, are we in that situation as well? Do we have kind of a whole of government with the US-ROK alliance ready to move should things move quickly in North Korea in terms of succession? So David, back to you.
Thank you, Patrick, and great comments from Jenny and Dr. Lee. I'd like to follow up on their points quickly before I cover that. For Dr. Lee, and I defer to his expertise on China, but it's been my experience that in addition to China wanting a UN mandate or some kind of international authorization, they also want an invitation. That they want somebody in North Korea to invite them in. That's been my sense in track twos, and the only time that they might intervene unilaterally is if there's a serious situation that affects China directly, such as like a nuclear accident at Yongbyon or something like that. And otherwise, I think you're right. They want a UN. They want UN authority. They want and they want an invitation. The other thing is, I think we should think about is we always think about North Korea resisting South Korea and U.S. forces. I think an intervention by China might bring great resistance to Chinese forces. And I think that's, I think any outsider is going to face resistance inside North Korea. from some remnants of the military, the regime, and the population. It is, after all, a guerrilla dynasty. And so I think we should consider that. And to the point about indicators on transition, and Jenny described, the complex problems. The past two transitions, when Kim Il-sung died and Kim Jong Un died, the country locked down all the borders, stopped movement, and of course recalled all Politburo members, to the big meeting in Pyongyang to really work on the transition. I think it's complicated now because of the coronavirus that the country has been locked down. They've closed their borders. And so it's going to be even more difficult for us to see indications that they're going through a transition because of the stringent control measures that have been applied really to defend against the coronavirus. I think some of those same measures will be taken if there is a transition, or better say, have already been taken. So I think that's going to even make it harder for us to see the transition. Now, in terms of escalation and contingency planning, I think it's really important. We often think about our actions are going to cause escalation or cause a response from the North. And of course, it's very prudent to think that way. But we also have to think about the effects of internal instability and what might happen to South Korea. If there is an implosion where the effects are contained within North Korea, that transitions to an explosion where those effects spill over into South Korea, into China, into Japan, and which really requires defensive measures on everybody's parts. Now, one way that in some of the Track 2 discussions that I've been involved with in South Korea and China, one of the proposals is in times of emergency, we really need to establish some kind of joint coordination center with China, South Korea, and the United States. I mean, this is one measure to prevent miscalculation among the three major parties. And so, that's something that we should really be in discussion with China and South Korea as a matter of routine. We should activate a joint coordination center to really keep each other informed and prevent any kind of miscalculation and escalation. Now, in terms of instability inside North Korea, obviously we have a great humanitarian problem. And, Dr. Lee mentioned that China would want to send in medical people and people to help and the like, but there's a huge security problem. Anything that goes on inside North Korea is going to be faced with a very real military threat. Whether South Korea intervenes, South Korea and the United States, or China, there's 1.2 million, soldiers under arms, 6 million reserves. And so there's great potential for resistance. So even something benign as providing medical care and humanitarian assistance and feeding people requires security. And of course, that can easily lead to miscalculation. I mean, that will look like an intervention and occupation. And so one of the things that we've often talked about, which I don't think we've done well enough, is really to prepare the information environment. Nobody is really providing information to the Korean people in the North, to the Korean military, to the second-tier leaders, and to the elite on what comes next. In a time of uncertainty, there does need to be transparency. And I think that it's important for the ROC, for the United States, and even for China to be transparent about their plans. Now, obviously, we don't talk about secret plans, but they really need to be transparent about intentions. And so what is the intention? And that goes to the big question that we need to really focus on if this, these scenarios play out. What do we want to achieve in Korea, on the entire Korean peninsula? Or a better way, people talk about end states. What is the acceptable, durable political arrangement on the Korean peninsula that is going to serve U.S. or ROC U.S. alliance interests for the long term? Those are questions that we really need to ask. And of course, China should be asking the same thing as well. And of course, that makes things very complicated. But we need to be thinking through what is the way ahead. And of course, right now, going back to Jenny's point about friction within the alliance, we have disparate views. I think the Moon administration wants peace and reconciliation, which is a laudable goal. But I don't think that that's realistic to think about in these kind of situations. I don't think we're going to be able to put the genie back in the bottle if Kim Jong Un is incapacitated, if he is dead, if there is a transition process that goes awry. And so we've got to think through, beyond what we currently want and what is really the long-term outcome. And so we're going to have to be prepared to deal with the contingencies. And of course, Jenny talked about the nuclear problem, but WMD is more than nuclear. 5,000 tons of chemical weapons are assumed to be there. A biological program that we believe exists. All of that is going to have to be dealt with, and all of those are very, very dangerous and are going to require security forces. And of course, the nuclear program and all these programs are complicated because their proximity is to China, not to the DMZ. And so China has the proximity, the ability to get there first, which may not be a bad thing, but there is going to be this competition, which I go back to, the necessity for coordination among all the parties. And that's one of the things I hope we can take out of this, because the uncertainty really requires that we have better coordination and sharing of information amongst all the parties. And that may be a naive thought, and it may be something that we will never get agreement on before something happens. But if we lay the groundwork now, maybe cooler heads will prevail in a crisis, and that we can implement some of those concepts that might prove useful in the way ahead. And I'll stop there.
David, thank you very much. Very important comments. I want to now just a third and final round here, starting with Dr. Lee, talking about China's expectations, maybe whether they've changed as well in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, in light of the economic recession, at least, that seems to be spreading globally as a consequence of this pandemic, whether this has altered Beijing's approach diplomatically, economically, in terms of thinking about North Korea's future. I also want to append to that question David Maxwell's last point, which is whether the Chinese would be amenable to a kind of a joint coordination facility, which I imagine could be both civil and military in nature, to share information for possible contingency. So, Dr. Lee, over to you.
Well, thank you. And I just raised my hand, really, the important point, that is that China probably needs an invitation from North Korea to intervene North Korean contingency situation. For those viewers who are not familiar with China-North Korea history, even though Xi Jinping and Kim Jong Un, they claim to be a blood alliance. That's the vocabulary they used during the Cold War, and they resurrected the blood alliance. They resurrected the vocabulary. Xi Jinping said North Korea-China relationship is the one and only relationship in the world, and Xi Jinping also used the relationship between China and North Korea as a lip and teeth relationship, also a vocabulary from the Cold War. So on the surface, the relationship is very close, very cozy, but then the reality is that there are also accumulated historical grievances, wars and invasions. The Korean Peninsula has been invaded by foreign countries over 900 times, and the interesting, majority of them invasions wars engaged with China, actually. So there are some historical trauma when North Korea, a smaller country, dealing with China, much bigger country, even though they alliance relationship at this moment. So that there is a joke that United States is 50 years of enemy for North Korea, but China is 5,000 years of enemy for North Korea. The joke that I heard from a North Korean interlocutor a few years back. So this is, I'm just sharing this joke as more like giving some nuance about the China-North Korea relationship on the surface, and also some what is the nature of the relationship. This year, for China-North Korea relationship, COVID-19, my understanding is that sometime in mid-March, China sent medical equipment to North Korea, but then North Korea shut down their borders, land, sea, and air. So, but then the International Red Cross team is operating in the Dandong, city of Dandong, the border city between China and North Korea, so that the International Red Cross team is delegating, sending that medical packages to North Korea. But then China is shy about how many, how much, and when, and what are the items that they are sending to North Korea. They are also keeping mum about Kim Jong Un's health, probably because going back to David's point that China wants North Korea to say, if they say ever about the conditions about Kim's health from North Korea's side rather than China saying that first, because it's also giving the face issue and the delicate relationship, the history between China and North Korea. Further down the road, this year is a very busy year for Xi Jinping because next year is the 100th anniversary of the founding of Chinese Communist Party. And China has a national mandate that is to establish, achieve a whole around the middle class society, 小康社会. And because of the COVID-19, as you know, the Chinese economy suffered a lot. So this year will be a very, from my perspective, China is a little bit more inward-looking year. Just like Trump is very busy with his elections this year. So Xi Jinping will be very busy in preparation for next year's 100-year celebration for Communist Party of China. That means that North Korea issue could be put on a back burner, not just from Washington, also from China. That's why, going back to the discussion about contingency, scholars, think tanks, track one-point meetings to prevent any miscommunication, miscalculations, wrongly interpreted intentions. This should be very robustly communicated when at the top government level might be busy with something else. That's why the civilian level, think tank scholars exchange is very important. And I also know that there is a October surprise discussion going on in Washington. That is that November hired all the time, but when in October, North Korea might do something to surprise or to undermine Trump. But then I think that from, I might be wrong, but from local perspective here, is that I think does Kim Jong Un like Trump as a president, or does Kim Jong Un like Democrat as president? I think Kim Jong Un like Trump because Trump is the only sitting U.S. president who was willing to sit down with Kim Jong Un twice or even thrice, including DMZ meeting, Singapore, Hanoi, DMZ. So there is a much more chance for Kim Jong Un to have Trump as a partner than any other Democratic president who focuses on deterrence, human rights issues. Trump does not put much emphasis on human rights, so North Korea finds it easier to deal with a person like Trump. So those are the caveat when from maybe going completely 180 degrees opposite in October. Maybe North Korea is doing something that might help Trump, so that North Korea wants to continue to have Trump as the U.S. president. So this is just the analytic I guess game that I play based on the Kim Jong Un's preferences. Just like the Xi Jinping, the China actually, even though Trump is being very tough with China, actually China prefers Trump as the U.S. president because China believes that Trump is undermining the U.S. democracy, U.S. power. Trump is internally undermining his system network with the alliance, which is the symbol of U.S. strength. So in a way that both North Korea, China wants to have Trump there. I'll stop there.
Absolutely, great comments. And turning back to Jenny and to David, we'll in order, talking about the diplomatic possibilities with North Korea, or the lack of possibilities. Interesting facets. One facet that's been raised is whether we need to shift the diplomacy to think not about denuclearization and peace, but just about avoiding miscalculation, avoiding misunderstanding as a basic goal needs to be reinforced through diplomacy, both track 1 official and unofficial track 2 diplomacy, perhaps. There's also the issue that the inter-Korean diplomacy, at least officially from Seoul's perspective, is continuing. And sort of sadly, Seoul had to have a unilateral Remembrance Day of the Panmunjom Declaration. I remember being in Panmunjom on April 27, 2 years ago, and the optimism that permeated Seoul at the time was in the world was phenomenal. When the first summit occurred between Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong Un, and now we have, of course, a stalemated diplomacy, and yet we also have the potential for, if not October surprise, some movement during the democratic election that will occur in the United States. South Korea, of course, just having a successful but surprising election in the sense that they held it despite the pandemic, and they also had a resounding victory for the Minju ruling party of President Moon, which was not forecast a few months earlier. And it seemed to come down as a referendum on his handling of the COVID-19 crisis, frankly, for the party. It may come down to a referendum on the pandemic in the United States in November as well. And nonetheless, an October surprise or some kind of provocation or gambit for diplomacy for a deal could affect the outcome even of an American election. So, Jenny, I put a lot on the table there for you to consider, and for David as well to follow up. And even though our time is running relatively short, would ask for you to address, Jenny, those diplomatic questions.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, there's a lot to choose from. I think, in terms of the elections, I would agree with Dr. Lee that Kim Jong Un most likely prefers Trump to stay as president, especially if the choice is between Trump and Biden. Biden to Kim Jong Un is the Obama administration, and North Korea did not have a good relationship with the Obama administration, did not like the policy of strategic patience, wasn't able to make any headway. Trump, of course, has met with Kim Jong Un, continues to talk about Kim Jong Un in a friendly, cooperative manner. And even if there isn't negotiations ongoing right now, that relationship still seems to be intact on both sides. They haven't attacked each other personally. They haven't insulted each other personally, even if they have jabbed at people within the administration and within the negotiating parties. So I think there's somewhat of an expectation if Trump stays in office in a second term, that at least some of those characters would be switched out, would be the normal trajectory. Whether that happens or not is unknown. And that there may be opportunities in a Trump administration with a different negotiating team to try again. I think, though, it comes back down to a fundamental problem of approach and of expectation. And I think the US still approaches this from the perspective, the sequencing perspective of we have to have denuclearization first before we can build trust and have peace. And the North Koreans really look at it the opposite way of we have to have trust building and peace first before we get to the end of the denuclearization road. And unfortunately, a different negotiating team, I don't think it's going to change that US way of thinking about the situation. How do we trust North Korea if they still have a nuclear weapons program and aren't working towards diminishing that program and that capability? So, as David had mentioned before, there seems to be a real disparate goals between the US and Seoul right now, because Seoul also sees it as like, let's build trust, let's build peace. That sequencing is we can have peace and reconciliation before we have full denuclearization, as long as they're simultaneously working towards mutual goals. But for the US, I think it's much more staunch on the position of denuclearization. Substantial denuclearization has to come first. And as long as we have that, it kind of doesn't matter who's on the negotiating team if that's really the premise that we're working off of. And I think this is also where this relationship with South Korea, the US and South Korea, the alliance relationship is not only about burden sharing, the tensions are not only about burden sharing, but also about how both sides have approached the North Korea issue, where South Korea wanted us to move much faster. And I think built that expectation up both in South Korea, but in Pyongyang as well, to Kim Jong Un, that this is possible. We're on board. If the two Koreas want it, why would anyone stand in their way? And I think they really underestimated what US interests in this process really are, and continue to want to move us in that direction. But the US, I think, is standing pretty firm.
Thank you very much. And David, turning back to you, and I'm reminded that when there was a succession with Kim Il-sung to Kim Jong-il, and then from Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un, there was some tactical progress made in diplomacy, very significantly in '94 in terms of the agreed framework, but also the Leap Day deal, although that was short-lived, it created a lot of hope. Jenny just raised the question of potential change in our negotiators, but it's North Korea's negotiators who could really change if someone like this, the 32-year-old Kim Yo Jong, the sister of Kim Jong Un, were elevated in some kind of arrangement. For instance, since she's one of the names talked about, but even if not, if we're just in this sort of stalemate, does Kim Jong Un want to wait out the American election and just wait until he sees who he's dealing with in 2021 before he makes any move, if he's willing to make any move toward diplomacy? David, your thoughts on the diplomatic course of relations here with North Korea in the coming months?
Yeah, great questions. And just to build on what Jenny said, I think, yes, we have a bad rap that we want denuclearization first, and both North and South Korea want to build trust. But I think the fact is our negotiating team has been very flexible. We've offered liaison offices, we've offered ways to build trust, without demand of total denuclearization. Our real demand, I think, has been substantive progress toward denuclearization, and we're willing to show signs of trust. And I think the comprehensive military agreement was a huge demonstration of trust from the South Koreans' point, but also from the alliance point of view. All the trust building measures have been really from the alliance and none from the North. But this idea of building trust and ending the U.S. hostile policy, which are the North's words, I think we shouldn't be lulled into a sense of complacency that we just have to build trust and then they will denuclearize. For North Korea's demand for us to end our hostile policy is really the code word for ending the alliance, for removing U.S. troops from the Korean Peninsula, for ending extended deterrence and the nuclear umbrella over South Korea and Japan. That is how they define being able to trust us. And of course, that's in keeping with their strategy to be able to dominate the peninsula. And I don't think there's any sign that strategy to dominate the peninsula has been walked back at all. And I doubt very much if Kim Yo Jong takes over that she would walk that back as well. Although I agree with you that whoever comes to power following Kim Jong Un, we should make an attempt to provide at least a short-term opportunity to move things forward. But I think we should not be lulled into a sense of complacency that all we have to do is build trust and then we can work towards denuclearization. And I think our negotiating team has done very well from our side, as well as trying to maintain positive relationships with South Korea. I think establishing the South Korean-U.S. strategy working group between MOFA and State has been a very good development and has really tried to mitigate some of the friction within the alliance, at least on that aspect. So I think we really need to proceed with an understanding of what North Korea's strategy is. And I just don't see that changing. And so diplomatically, and the last thing I'd like to say, you mentioned about changing from a strategy of denuclearization to a strategy of preventing miscalculation, and misunderstanding. Actually, I think that's been about 70 years, built on a foundation of deterrence. We can deter a nuclear attack. We can deter a conventional attack. And we've been successful at doing that. And I think our diplomacy has really been, back channel, New York channel, through intermediaries, through China, through South Korea, has really been to try to prevent miscalculation and misunderstanding, behind the scenes. But today we are where we are with North Korea with a real nuclear threat. And I think for us to back off that would be probably political suicide for anyone, for President Trump or for his successors. I think we have to stay focused on the nuclear problem, and which really goes to the point we've got to be able to take the whole problem, enlarge the problem. We can't look just at the nuclear problem. And that's really, I think, the key aspect. We've got to maintain deterrence. We have to conduct diplomacy. We've got to focus on denuclearization, transparency to prevent miscalculation and misunderstanding. And of course, resting on the strength of the ROC-US alliance. I think those are the things we have to do from a holistic perspective. And the last thing I'll say is, while we can deter nuclear attack, we can deter conventional attack, we cannot deter the effects of instability and regime collapse. And that's why we need to use this as a wake-up call to dust off the contingency plans, to train for them. And even though, as Jenny said, we've had contingency plans for a long time and we've conducted exercises, very few people in power today in leadership positions have been around when we did that. And so just the lesson I'll take away is that one of the reasons that South Korea has been so successful in the COVID crisis is because they did a huge exercise, interagency exercise in December for a pandemic. And that prepared them. That was fortuitous, it was luck, but it shows the value of continuous training and preparation. And you can't wait for crises to occur. You've got to continuously prepare and plan for the future. And of course, as Eisenhower said, plans are nothing, planning is everything. It's got to be continuous and iterative. You just can't write a contingency plan and put it on the shelf. You've got to prepare for the worst case. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
David, those are eloquent closing remarks, but I do want to come back to Dr. Lee and Jenny at least and just get what is their one takeaway from this episode or this discussion, just in 15 seconds or less. Is there a key point here that you just want to highlight again, or that comes to mind now, Dr. Lee?
Well, I just want to tag along the great eloquent comments made by David, emphasizing both the trust building at the same time the deterrence. And I think we could do more on trust building, actually. For example, during the Hanoi summit, Trump walked away from the prepared lunch. There is some cultural sensitivity. In Asian culture, a lot of important deals are done during the mealtime. Something that you couldn't make an agreement, actually, may be done, agreed upon during the mealtime. That's why, meal diplomacy is very, very important. But then the water was poured and all the food was prepared, the table was set up, and Trump walked away. It was lunch hour, and what might have Kim Jong Un, even though he was a dictator, but as a human being, he could have felt. I think he could have felt tremendous insult from Asian perspective. So this kind of cultural sensitivity, I think, is, even though it is minor compared to the real engineering of negotiations, but then cultural diplomacy, understanding what works best and what makes people comfortable and open up their mind is very important. Particularly that is also coming from my experience as well, living in a China socialist country for over 10 years. They are sometimes we say something, but they become very suspicious. Even North Korea, I know an American tour guide. I wouldn't name his name, but then when he was in Pyongyang, he had a lot of questions about what's the historical background. Could you tell me more about this background? And then North Korea felt that he was a spy agent, so that North Korea Foreign Ministry barred his passport. He was just tour guide asking more about historical background so that he could play a better tour guide. But then North Korea perspective, being very suspicious, they misunderstood he is working as an intelligence agent sent by the U.S. government. So, when you're dealing with a different system, different cultural, political system, the sensitivity and knowing how the culture works, I think is very important as much as the intricacies about the engineering of the real negotiation itself.
Well, thank you. Yeah, the trust building during the diplomacy when you're at a summit like you were at Hanoi is one thing. Having trust building when you're missing the leader of North Korea is maybe another matter. But let me turn to Jenny Town for her final thought just in a few seconds.
Sure, and just to build on David's point about constant practice, You know, when we saw Kim Il-sung die and Kim Jong-il's death, the successor had already been named. The expectation was already there. It was a matter of looking at it of, will this work or not? But the question of who was going to take over and how that was going to look was pretty set. We don't have that now. And as David said, a lot of the people who are in office now haven't been through that exercise. The mechanisms for practicing, for consultation, for communication about this really do need to be constant and revived, because there are so many contingency factors these days that are affecting this. And COVID-19 is a big example of something, this black swan event that comes out of nowhere, that South Korea was prepared for because they've dealt with it more recently. The US has never dealt with it. And so we were completely unable to get a plan off the ground, even though plans existed. And so I think, you know, this is, as David said at the beginning, a wake-up call of planning needs to be constant and consistent and adapt to the times that we're in.
Well, on behalf of Hudson Institute, Dr. Lee Seung-hyun, Jenny Town, and David Maxwell, I think we're all just a little more informed, and North Korea is just a little less inscrutable than an hour ago. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.